welcome to the course Introduction to the Psychology of Language. I am Dr. Ark Verma from IIT Kanpur and we are in the 4th week of the course. As you know, we have been talking about various aspects of word processing in this week. We have been talking about aspects of meaning, aspects of lexical access and so on. In today's lecture, I will talk to you about ambiguity and the representation of meaning in the brain. Now, one of the things that we sometimes come across is words that may have more than one meaning, and these words might have more than one meaning sometimes in a similar context and sometimes across different contexts. Say for example, mostly however it will happen that within one particular context a word will have that specific meaning. So, it is very easy to resolve. However, sometimes what happens is that the context is not really very helpful and the conversation is kind of not giving us any clues as to what this word particularly means. Let us take an example. Let us take the case of the word bank. Now, for example, bank, the word has two probable meanings. One is the bank as the money institution, the financial institution called the bank, and the other could be the riverside. Now, for example, if I tell you that I want to have my lunch by the bank, it could either mean that I want to have my lunch by the financial institution, somewhere there is a good restaurant around and I am going to have my lunch there. Or it could mean, suppose if I am living in a city which has lots of rivers and lakes or canals or those kind of things, and if I am telling you okay, meet me at 4 and I am going to have my lunch there at by the bank. So, then you will probably make up that okay, this guy is going to have lunch by the riverside. Now, depending upon the context and the scenario, you will be able to interpret which exact word or which exact meaning of the word bank is what I am using. However, sometimes these two have the potential to get really mixed up and people will have difficulty in figuring out what exactly is the bank that I am referring to. These kind of scenarios are called ambiguous scenarios, and this leads to a particular phenomena called lexical ambiguity. What is lexical ambiguity? Lexical ambiguity is the case where the word for one particular word you do not really definitively know which is the meaning that is being used. Remember the conversation Humpty was having with Alice and where he said that although words can mean a variety of things, we have to choose which is to be the master of all, which is going to be the primary meaning, the one that I have intended, and that is something that will kind of be very important for the communication. So, in these kinds of scenarios we could ask a few questions, and questions could be like, say for example, what happens if you are hearing a word or reading a word that has more than one meaning? More specifically, do we straight away go to the contextually appropriate meaning, okay, this is the meaning and there is no doubt, no conflict whatsoever, or we have to sort through a number of different possible meanings and from those meanings we basically select the correct and the most suitable meaning. So, there are two of these scenarios possible in cases of lexical ambiguity, and the resolution of this conflict basically has been referred to as lexical ambiguity resolution. So, let us see. There are two hypotheses that explain that okay, this is something that might happen. According to the exclusive access hypothesis, one can use cues from the environment to immediately select the contextually appropriate meaning of the word, and so there is no room for any kind of conflict or confusion whatsoever. However, the exhaustive access hypothesis says that in some cases word forms may simultaneously activate multiple possible meanings and that they are associated with, and that could lead to a lot of possible confusion for the listener as to which meaning, or listener or the reader as to which meaning is more appropriate in this given context or for this particular utterance. So, there are two of these hypotheses you have to remember, the exclusive access hypothesis and the exhaustive access hypothesis. Moving on, let us discuss one of the experiments that wherein this was tested. So, these experiments, these two hypotheses, competing hypotheses, were first tested in Swiney's experiment in 1979, and this was a very interesting setup. You have this word utterance that the participants are hearing in their headphones, and on the same time they are doing a lexical decision task on the computer screen wherein some target words are appearing. So, let me read out the sentence for you. Rumor had it that for years the government building had been plagued with problems. The man was not surprised when he found several spiders, roaches and other bugs in the corner of the room. Now, the critical word here in this utterance is the word bugs. Bugs can stand for insects. So, bug is an insect, you know. So, the word bugs can stand for many insects of that kind that were found in the particular building, or because this is a government building, there is a possibility that somebody needs some top secret information and has put a bug, which is a spy listening device, in that particular building. Now, there are two possible meanings of this word bug. One is the spy device and the other is that of insect, and basically what was being tested in this experiment is which of the two meanings are activated by the listeners. So, what they did was, while the participants were listening this in their headphones, they actually presented words, some which could align with the meaning of bugs, that is insects, and others which could align with the meaning, that is spy device. And the participants basically had to just take word or non-word lexical decisions while they were hearing this, and the words will basically come very closely aligned to the word bugs in the utterance. So, for example, they showed that one of the meanings was the word ant. You can see the graph here, and the other meaning was the word spy, and an unrelated thing is sky. You see, this spy is the word ant is much faster recognized as compared to the other two words, which probably could tell us that the insect related meaning was heavily activated and was probably dominating most of the participants. And this other meaning, spy device, is also activated because the word spy also receives a little bit of that facilitation. So, it means for us, if you look at that, both kinds of meanings, the insect meaning and the spy device meaning, have both been activated in this particular scenario. Now, let us look at the sentence again and see how this could have happened. If you look at the sentence, if you look at this utterance, there is a particular local context to it and there is a particular global context to it. If I am just reading this sentence, the man was not surprised when he found several spiders, roaches and other bugs, because there is this mention of other insects. The insect meaning of bug really gets a lot of support and really gets primed up. So, there is no surprise that that is one that is receiving the most benefit. However, if you read or pay attention to the entire utterance, starting from rumor had it that for years the government building had been plagued with problems, because we are talking about a government building, and you might have seen in so many movies people need secret information out of the government buildings. It also kind of creates a possibility for the more imaginative ones that the spy device meaning could also be the one that is intended here. Alright, so you see both meanings are getting activated irrespective of the context sort of in this particular experiment. This result certainly favors what is referred to as the exhaustive access hypothesis. So, this is something interesting. Now, if both kinds of meanings are getting activated when we hear the ambiguous word, how do we even figure out which is the correct meaning of the utterance? Because suppose this is happening all the time, as a listener, how do you react very quickly and react according to the correct intended meaning of a particular utterance? Now, the answer is that that mostly context affects the meaning selection eventually, and even though it does not really appear to rule out the activation of competing meanings, but for the most part it already gives a lot of support to the meaning that is appropriate to the context. So, mostly you will not really be in trouble and you will be able to really deliver as to okay, this is the actual meaning that was intended. In follow-up experiments investigating meaning selection for ambiguous words, it has also been observed that the amount of time that elapses between the utterance and the presentation of the target word also affects which of the meanings or whether both or just one of the contextually appropriate meanings will be activated. Let us look at that. Different pattern of results were observed at different SOAs. SOA is basically stimulus onset asynchrony, basically tells us that this was the prime word and this was the target word in time. The target word could be closer to the prime or it could be further off from the prime, and prime is the word bugs basically in the last experiment. Now, if the target words were presented immediately after the ambiguous word, it was found that both of the meanings were necessarily activated. But if you kind of wait for around 250 to 500 milliseconds in that time window after the ambiguous words, and you present the target word 250 to 500 milliseconds after the ambiguous words, usually only the contextually appropriate meaning showed up. Okay. So, it probably seems that within that time period of 0.25 to 0.50 seconds, the system kind of sorts, evaluates the other features in the environment and settles down with the correct meaning. So, ambiguity, in fact, if it is happening for a very, very short period of time. However, it is interesting for psycholinguists to look at in what scenarios this is getting activated and what are the processes that we are using, what are the cues that we are using to achieve this lexical ambiguity resolution. Moving on, as I said, the role of context is very important. Even before that, let us discuss a little bit as to meaning dominance in case of these ambiguous words. Now, the idea of meaning dominance is that some meanings for particular words might be the more dominant meaning. Say for example, if both meanings have to occur with the word, one of these meanings could be occurring 80-90% of the time, and while the other one could be occurring only up to 10 to 15% of the time. The meaning that occurs more number of times or is used much more commonly is referred to as the dominant meaning. So, in the case of the word bank that I was discussing, the meaning that refers to the financial institution, etc., is probably the much more dominant meaning as compared to the meaning with respect to the riverside. At least especially in, if you're living in the cities and you're not really, your general conversation does not really involve going around banks, etc. Okay. So, this is this concept of meaning dominance, and on the basis of meaning dominance, basically what you can do is you can divide the ambiguous words into two varieties. One of them could be biased ambiguous words, wherein there is one meaning which is particularly dominant, and balanced ambiguous words where neither of the meanings are particularly dominant and they are both sort of have an equal probability of getting activated or getting used at any point in time. So, this is one thing that I would like you to remember, and people kind of did some of the experiments to check this out and how this really works. So, in an eye tracking experiment, what happens were that people read text, sentences that is, and their eye movements while they were reading those texts were recorded. What did they find? They find that when people were reading balanced words, they fixated on those words slightly longer as compared to when they were reading biased ambiguous words. What should this tell us? This probably tells us that people were spending a little bit more time deriving meaning out of the balanced ambiguous words as compared to deriving meaning out of the biased ambiguous words, because they already have one meaning which is easy to interpret. Now, this is this, but say for example, if context starts interacting with whether a word is balanced or biased, that also could lead to an interesting scenario. Say for example, you could have a neutral context which kind of does not really help out any of the two meanings, or you could have a biasing context which could help only one particular meaning of the ambiguous word. Suppose the conversation is going on about money and shares and all those kind of financial instruments, and then the word bank figures up. Okay. Then obviously the context is helping the financial institution meaning of the word. Or say for example, if the talk is about a picnic where somebody has gone in the countryside, and there is talk of valleys and rivers and whatnot, then maybe the context should be favoring the riverside meaning of the word bank. So, depending upon how the context is, the context can interact with whether a word is balanced ambiguous word or a biased ambiguous words. Now, these biasing contexts have been found to cause balanced ambiguous words to be processed as quickly as the unambiguous words. So, for example, if there is some help from the context, you will be able to read the balanced ambiguous words almost as quickly as the unambiguous words, because both factors are, if probably pointing towards the same meaning, it becomes much easier for the person to resolve the ambiguity here. Biasing contexts, however, may have different effects on biased ambiguous words depending upon whether their dominant or non-dominant meaning is being supported. Suppose in a biasing context the non-dominant meaning is supported, then what do you expect? I would say that probably the two effects will interact and probably lead to a very interesting reaction time profile, wherein you could see some costs of this interaction with context. All right. So, or maybe the non-balanced meaning kind of can be primed in such a way that it dupes the non-dominant and dupes the dominant meaning, at least for that particular scenario. Now, they did this neuroimaging experiment and showed that some factors of meaning dominance and context differentially affected the neural response to sentences containing ambiguous words. So, you can see that there are differential effects at the level of the brain with respect to whether the context is biasing or neutral, or whether the ambiguous word is biased or balanced. What did they find? They find that balanced ambiguous words are read slowly in neutral contexts, quickly in biasing contexts, where biased ambiguous words are quick, whereas biased ambiguous words are read quickly in biasing contexts, but slowly in neutral contexts. So, this is obviously, I think it is intuitively expected. If balanced ambiguous word gets help from the context, it will read fastly. If it is not helped by the context, it will get read slowly. On the other hand, the biased ambiguous words can also be read quickly in biasing context when the meaning is supported, dominant meaning is supported, and they will be read slowly in a neutral context. Okay. So, this is something that has to be taken into account. On the basis of this very interesting interaction between the context and whether the ambiguous word is balanced or biased, they have come up with a new theory which is basically called the reordered access theory. And the reordered access theory basically says that both factors should affect the kind of word meanings that you will make out of these words, and the context and the two variables are meaning dominance and context. Okay, so both of these will interact to actually tell you which meaning is more activated at this particular scenario. Okay, so this is about ambiguity resolution. Let me move to the next section of today's talk, and we are now going to talk a little bit about neural bases of lexical access. We have talked a little bit about lexical access. We have talked actually quite a lot about lexical access, which is what lexical access is. How do you reach the word form? How do you access the word form in the in your semantic system, in your memory system? And what we are going to talk about today is how easy or difficult it could be to access this word form neurally at the level of the brain. Okay. Now, just to start this topic, mostly what has been found is when people experience brain damage, neuropsychological studies, and when you measure the activity in the intact brain, that is normal cognitive neuroscience, neurophysiological neuroimaging kind of studies, offer a great way to study how word meanings are organized in the brain. Say for example, for a normal brain, you kind of almost are interacting with a sort of opaque system. You do not know what led to this particular output. But say for example, if you are looking at particular patterns in people who have unfortunately brain damage or some kind of brain injury, lesions and strokes and whatnot, that kind of sometimes can lead to very interesting patterns, and those interesting patterns could tell you that okay, if this area of the brain is damaged, this is the kind of meaning deficit that is being experienced. So maybe this area has something to do with that aspect of meaning. This is the deduction that psychologists or neuropsychologists, cognitive neuroscientists hope to take out of these kinds of studies. So we look at different kinds of studies here. Now, neuropsychological approaches have demonstrated that knowledge of concepts and the knowledge of word forms are sort of handled by quasi-independent systems in the brain. So, you might the semantic part, the knowledge about a particular concept, say for example, whether this pen is used for writing or something is separately stored as compared to the word form pen. Okay. So, this is the distinction that the neuropsychological approaches have showed us. So, just summarizing that, so people can have intact knowledge of concepts without being able to recover information about the word forms that refer to those concepts, and vice versa. So, there could be some people who cannot really name an object when you show it to them, but they can tell you how the object is used, what are its dimensions, shape, color, uses, whatnot. Okay. There could be other kinds of patients who will basically be able to name them appropriately, but if you ask them some knowledge about these objects, they will probably not be able to do that. So, this kind of dissociation exists, and this kind of dissociation tells us that apparently these two kinds of information are stored separately in the human brain. Moving on, neuroimaging experiments, they also kind of support a sort of an interesting idea, and they support a shared semantic system for words and pictures, but some brain areas have been shown to respond more to words than to pictures, and vice versa. So they say that because accessing words or accessing pictures is sort of very similar, the only the only problem is that the route is slightly different. Obviously you also have to do a little bit of a visual analysis with words, you have to do a little bit of a visual analysis to look at what the picture is, and then it directly goes to the conceptual store. With words you'll probably do the visual analysis, reach the sound or phonological representation, and then reach to the conceptual store. So there is a little bit of a difference, but say for example it has also been shown that some areas of the brain respond more to words while some other areas of the brain respond more to pictures. So that is been said, and this kind of happens across different kinds of tasks. So for example, when subjects were asked to judge the similarity between word meanings or different kinds of pictures, both kinds of stimuli were found to activate a network of left hemisphere brain areas, especially the superior occipital cortex, the inferior temporal lobes, and the inferior frontal lobe. So these are the areas in the brain that were found to be activated. Now, word specific activity was also however, word specific activity only specific to words were observed in the region of the left hemisphere in this near the superior temporal and the medial areas and the anterior temporal lobes, as well as also in the frontal cortex. Pictures however selectively activated a region near the left superior temporal sulcus. So you see there is a sort of a distinction between where words are creating brain activity versus where pictures are creating brain activity. Also, different kinds of words appeared to activate different areas of the brain, potentially reflecting differences in their meaning. They basically telling us that if the word means these kind of things, these areas will be recruited. If the word means these kind of things, these areas will be recruited. Okay, and a very interesting example was Alex Martin's study wherein they showed pictures of animals and tools and had participants say the names of these pictured objects silently to themselves. So the task is that a screen, a particular picture will come, and then another will come, and another will come, and you just have to name the picture silently. So a picture of a dog came, and you in your head said dog, and then you said, so for it's not audible, it's just silently to themselves. Now what happens is, what they find is different patterns of activation in the brain were observed for animals and tools, and greater activity was observed in the occipital regions when people were naming animals, and greater activity was observed in inferior frontal regions when they were naming tools. Now why does this differential activity actually emerge? You have to really look at what is a particular concept, and a particular concept by nature of itself will activate particular kinds of meanings and will activate particular kinds of brain areas as opposed to a specific set of it. Say for example, animals, there is a lot of analysis of visual form, etc. You probably need to do, and that's why the occipital regions probably get activated more, whereas tools, there is a lot of aspect of action related to them. So the inferior frontal is the area in the motor cortex which probably seems to get primed up whenever you're talking about tools like hammer, axe, scissor, those kind of things. Neuroimaging and neuropsychological approaches both have shown that brain areas involved in processing a word basically depend upon what kind of task people are doing. It also not only depends on the kind of concepts people are talking about, but also the kind of tasks people are doing with that concept. Say for example, when people were asked to generate the action that goes on with a noun like a hammer, activity is found to be focused in the anterior cingulate gyrus, the left inferior frontal lobes, and the right cerebellum. If they were merely asked to just recognize or do something else, hopefully certain different areas of the brain would have shown activation. Now let us take a few examples. In a seminal PET study, PET is basically positron emission tomography. It is a simple neuroimaging technique where a radioactive isotope is injected in the person's bloodstream, and that radioactive isotope reaches the brain, and the assumption is that those areas of the brain are recruited for a particular task. Blood flows, blood flow kind of goes there, and that is where this radioactive isotope will move, and what people can do is they can track this radioactive isotope. So that gives you an idea of which areas of the brain are recruited for what kind of task. So, coming back, in seminal PET study, Mike Posner and colleagues, they measured the brain's response to sets of nouns under different task conditions. So, it was all, the stimuli were all nouns, but there could be three kinds of tasks that people could be doing, and the expectation was that the three different kinds of tasks will recruit the three different kinds of regions in the brain. Let us look at that more closely now. In one of the conditions, brain activity was measured during passive perception of words as compared to fixation cross baseline. So, in one screen there is just fixation and you are measuring brain activity, on the other screen instead of the fixation the word is written and the person just has to read the word and brain activity is measured. Nothing really actively a participant is doing here. There is another condition. In the dangerous animals condition, participants would view a list of nouns and decide whether each one represented a dangerous animal or not. So, I could present you a list of nouns, some animals, some other things, and just ask you whether this particular noun represents a dangerous animal or not. This is sort of a semantic categorization task. Okay. And so, this is the second kind of task. The third task was the action generation task. You will be again presented with a bunch of nouns, some of them tools, and basically what you will be asked to do is that what kind of think about an action that you will do with this object. Suppose I am showing you a picture of a scissor, you imagine cutting. If I show you a picture of a hammer, you imagine pounding a nail. If I show you a picture of an axe, you imagine cutting. So, those kind of things. Now, what did they find? They found that passively viewing words and not really doing anything about them led to greater activity mainly in the occipital lobes in both the cerebral hemispheres. Tasks that tapped semantic features, that is dangerous animal task, and basically produced left lateralized activation in the frontal lobes. So, this is happening in the second condition. So, here is the figure. You can see that if you look at the top thing, you will see that there is triangles which is basically coming out of more neural activity in the occipital lobes, and then the squares are basically where activity is happening in the action generation task. So, you see the squares are basically in primarily in the motor cortex area, and the circles are basically in the frontal kind of lobes, wherein basically you are talking about it's happening bilaterally, you are basically talking about the dangerous animals condition. Okay. Also, in a different study, they found that different patterns of brain activity is observed between tasks that focus on the semantic properties of the words in contrast to their phonological properties. So, in the last study, we actually talked mainly about semantic properties. In this task, we could either ask participants to look at the phonological property, whether the word rhymes with this word or not, or whether the word means this or not, the semantic versus phonological distinction. PET data showed significant neural activity throughout the substantial parts of the left temporal lobe in response to semantic judgments, in bilateral activation in more dorsal areas in response to how words sound. So, activity in the left temporal lobe is happening in response to semantic judgments, and activity in the more dorsal areas bilaterally is happening with respect to sounding. Okay, with respect to the sound of the word. So, here you can look at a figure again borrowed from Traxler, that semantic judgments activate more of this area in the left hemisphere, whereas syllable judgments, whether the syllable rhymes with something or not, kind of is activating areas both in the left and the right hemisphere, and which is slightly more dorsal to this. Now, there are several kinds of models that can kind of try and explain the findings or why such pattern of findings is emerging. One of the set of models could be referred to as processing models. Processing models basically focus on the process that is leading to this kind of activation being shown. So, processing models, basically some of them assume a separate set for input representations from auditory and visual processing. So, if for example, they say that when you hear words, the auditory input versus when you read words, that is visual input, could be processed from different kinds of neural circuits. And say for example, they say that auditory input more strongly would activate something called the vernix area near the junction of the occipital temporal and the parietal lobes, and the visual input may not activate this area at all. Brain regions involved in auditory word processing also would include the superior temporal lobes bilaterally. These regions together are involved in the analyzing the acoustic and phonetic properties of the input, and some theories suggest that a portion of this superior posterior temporal lobe in the left hemisphere contains what is referred to as the phonological word form area. So, the area of the brain near the superior posterior temporal lobe in the left hemisphere basically is dedicatedly involved to auditory word processing, and that is why it has been referred to as the phonological word form area. And this phonological word form area is supposed to be responsible for mapping acoustic information to the stored representations of individual words. So as soon as you hear word, the mode of access is the sound, and this mode of access primarily activates the regions around the phonological word form area and connects them to the other stored conceptual and other kinds of information. In contrast, basic visual processing of written words, dealing with the script, how does the script really go about, basically is conducted by portions of the striate cortex and the extrastriate visual cortex in the occipital lobes. It's the area at the back completely, and this happens in both the hemispheres. Also, further processing of written words is associated with activity in what is referred to as the visual word form area, and this area is in the left hemisphere anterior to basic visual processing area, slightly further from the occipital lobes, and that is near the other pericerebral cortical regions, which are thought also to be involved slightly in the phonological and semantic processing. So this visual word form area is probably something that will always get activated whenever you are reading a word, because this particular area negotiates with the script, gets you the phonological representations, and then later leads you to the conceptual properties of the words that you are dealing with. So this area has been shown to enunciable letter strings, but not to spoken words of word-like stimuli, and it has been shown that this area does not really respond to complex visual stimuli other than words. So this could be the area of the brain that responds only to words, written strings which are pronounceable, and not to, say for example, either houses or faces or other kinds of visual objects. So here you can see the visual word form area. You can see on the left hemisphere there is this bunch of stuff that is getting activated. That is typically where the location of the visual word form area has been found to be. So moving on, Hannah Damasio and her colleagues, they were tried to test over 100 brain damaged patients, and they correlated their performance on tasks involving the naming of tools, animals and people. By mapping locations of the brain lesions and comparing lesion location with performance to different kinds of words, what Damasio's group found was that brain damage in the posterior areas of the left temporal lobe correlated with deficits to naming tools. Damage to the adjacent more anterior regions in the same lobe was correlated with deficits on animals, and damage to the temporal pole basically was correlated with deficits to knowledge about people. Let us look at this a little bit more closely. Most critically, the vast majority of Damasio's patients could actually define the concepts that they could not name. So the idea is, even if there are deficits being observed, the deficits are limited to word form access and not really the semantic information. They could define and talk about the concepts that they were asked to name, but they could probably not name these objects as well as a normal individual would. So for example, a patient might respond to a picture of a skunk saying, oh, that animal makes a terrible smell. If you get too close to it, it is black and white and it gets squashed on the road by cars someday. Now skunk is a sort of a rodent animal that is commonly found in the United States. You can kind of imagine something very similar to a squirrel or something like that. Actually it's slightly much larger than a squirrel though. But the idea is that you know about the concept. Suppose I am showing you a picture of a cat, so you know something about the cat, but even though you are not being able to name the word cat and name this concept of cat. Okay. So when they looked at the results, Damasio and colleagues suggested that temporal regions are affected by the patient's lesions are responsible for this intermediary connection between the word form information and the semantic information about those concepts. And these intermediary processes are those that typically provide the links between distributed conceptual knowledge and phonological word form knowledge. So conceptual knowledge, as we said when we began this discussion, we said that conceptual knowledge is probably being stored separately, and word form knowledge, whether it is phonological or visual, might be stored separately. So here what they are finding out is that the temporal regions are being affected mostly, are basically being kind of found in as intermediary processes between the phonological word form and the concept. Okay. Also, they found that phonological word form knowledge is probably supported by language areas in the superior temporal lobe and the temporal parietal occipital junction. So there is this particular area of the brain. Now, this is something very interesting. It kind of gets us started on the neural basis of how lexical access might be happening, and at least there is one takeaway that you can kind of conclude is that word form related information is probably being stored separately to information about the concept and about its meaning and so on. Okay, I'd like to end today's talk by reading out this quote from Damasio, basically coming out from that study, and what they say is that when the concept of a given tool is evoked based on the activation of several regions which support pertinent conceptual knowledge, an intermediary region becomes active and promotes the explicit representation of phonemic knowledge pertaining to the word form which denotes the given tool. So, if I am saying hammer, there is this hammer and r. This is the phonological knowledge which is associated with that tool. What that tool is and what that tool does is probably being stored separately, but this knowledge needs to be linked with this so as to make me name this whenever I want to. So, there is this set of intermediary process which are connecting this phonological knowledge with the conceptual knowledge about the tool. That is typically what Damasio is saying. So, this explicit representation of phonemic knowledge pertaining to the word form which denotes the given tool. When a concept from another category is evoked, that of a particular person for example, a different intermediary region should be involved. So, tools, phonological knowledge, different intermediary process, people, phonological knowledge, different intermediary process, and any other kind of concept different. So, the idea is that these different intermediary processes might be mediating the linkages between the word form and the semantic information for different kinds of concepts. That is typically what you can take away from this study from Damasio, and that should be all for today's talk, and I will talk to you something more about neural basis of lexical organization in the next talk. Thank you.